Jamil Jaffer with us, founder and executive director of the National Security Institute at George Mason University. He's also the former associate counsel to President George W. Bush. Jamil, as always, thank you. I appreciate your thoughts on all these important issues. First of all, your reaction to Abbas's remarks there.
Oh, look, Marni, obviously President Abbas has a constituency he represents. He obviously wants the war in Gaza to end. There's a lot of folks that want the war in Gaza to end. That's going to require the hostages to be handed over and Hamas to be agreed to put down its weapons. And the reality is that the Palestinian Authority that Abu Mazen, Prime Minister Abbas, controlled, has not had control of the Gaza Strip for the better part of nearly, well over a decade, if not longer. And so the question becomes, how does the Palestinian Authority regain control of the Gaza Strip? How do they ensure that Israel and the Palestinian state can live in harmony if there is to be a Palestinian state? And that's the real question. And we didn't hear a lot about that. We heard about a rejection of Hamas. That's the right thing for Prime Minister Abbas to say. He talked about the need for hostages to be handed over. But the reality is that without an agreement on security for both the Palestinian people and for the Israelis, this thing doesn't work. And that requires the U.S. and the Israelis to be at the table. And that's not currently the case.
Let's talk about this meeting with the Turkish president. How would you characterize U.S. relations with Turkey and its president now and the previous meeting with President Trump, which happened, I believe, in 2019?
Well, look, obviously, Turkey is a NATO ally. They're the second largest military in NATO. At the same time, they're, a challenging nation for us because they're buying weapons like the S-400 missiles from Russia. That doesn't make sense. Those missiles don't operate with the NATO systems. Turkey doesn't always seem aligned with NATO or U.S. interests. And so the question becomes, how does President Trump and President Erdogan come to some sort of a consensus on what is right for both Turkey and the United States and NATO writ large? NATO is strong with Turkey in and a productive member. Turkey is strong with being part of the NATO alliance. Everyone recognizes that. The question is, how do we prevent them from being so close to the Russians? And part of that involves, I think, these arms deals that President Trump is talking about. That's good for American industry, good for Turkey to be in the mix, but they cannot continue to buy weapons and play footsie with the Russians. That is no longer acceptable. We need to be clear about that. And Prime Minister Erdogan needs to come to that, or President Erdogan needs to come to that as well. Hopefully, President Trump and President Erdogan can find middle ground consensus on that issue.
Yeah, the F-16 deal. He talked about the F-35 talks. What strategic role does Turkey play in the region, just based on its location?
Yeah. Well, look, he could not play a more important strategic role, has for decades. It's at the heart, that bridge between Asia and Europe, the Middle East just to the south, Europe to the north and west. Obviously, it is a critical part of getting things done. And Turkey, I think, wants to be recognized for that role. But the problem is, the challenge is that Turkey needs to play a productive role. Turkey has not always done the right thing by the United States and by our NATO allies. You look at their role in Syria, it's not always the most productive one. But I think there is room for us to work with Turkey. In theory, they're a large secular democracy. That's weakened a little bit with the rise of certain parties, including Prime Minister Erdogan's party in Turkey. That being said, I think there's a lot more common ground between us and Turkey than there is a difference. And I think President Erdogan just needs to come to that and realize that he is stronger and we are stronger with him in the tent and fully in the tent, not with one foot out, working with, Syrian rebels, working against our allies in the region, the Kurds, and working with Russia. That is not productive for Turkey, not productive for the NATO alliance, and frankly, will not be productive for the United States and won't result in a long-term good relationship.
Finally, more broadly speaking, the 80th gathering of the UN General Assembly in New York, the president was very critical of the body as a whole, and he was also frustrated with some technical issues that happened prior to his remarks, the escalator, the teleprompter. Is he fair in his criticism of this body?
Well, look, the UN does need reform, and the UN's organizations and underlying institutions have faced challenges. We see what we learned about UNRWA and its work in Gaza. Unfortunately, collaborating with Hamas, that's not what we need UN organizations doing. At the same time, the UN is a critically important part of ensuring that America is able to play a strong role in the world. The U.S. has a veto at the UN Security Council, as do all the 5 permanent members. It's located in New York. It's a good place for us to get our priorities elevated. But the UN has its challenges, and we need to be candid about those. And it's okay for the President of the United States to be tough on the UN and expect reform. At the same time, It is not productive when we're shooting our own allies in the foot constantly. And so some middle ground, right? President Trump, I think, was rightly tough. Was he too tough? There's an argument to be made, but at some level, we need the Europeans to take responsibility for their own security. We can come alongside them. So there's productiveness to be had here. The president did show up. He didn't blow it off, but he was very tough. And we'll now see how this plays out. I will say I was in Munich when J.D. Vance gave a similarly tough speech earlier this year. And it was uncomfortable. I'll be totally candid with you. At the same time, it did light a fire in the Europeans to do more on their own security and to contribute more to NATO and to do what they've said they were going to do. That's a good thing. Tough talk is sometimes helpful, but if it goes overboard, that's when it's a problem. The president was right there on the line. We'll see how it plays out over the next few weeks and months.
Yeah, well, we're at an important point in history and global security. Jamil, always appreciate your thoughts. Thank you.